The boy had not eaten in almost 2 days, and still the first thing he did when he saw the old man struggling with 2 grocery bags on the corner of 8th and Marshall was step forward and say, "Let me carry that for you, sir." No one around them slowed down. No one looked. In a city like Cleveland, in a neighborhood like this one, a small black boy speaking to a white-haired stranger was the kind of moment people walked past on purpose, the way you walk past a stray dog you cannot afford to feed. But that boy, Elijah Monroe, 10 years old and so thin his elbows looked sharp through his sleeves, did not know that the man in the long gray coat was worth more money than every house, every car, every storefront on that whole block combined. He only knew that the man was tired. He only knew that one of the bags was about to tear. He only knew that helping someone, even when you had nothing, was the one thing his mother had told him before she died that he should never stop doing. That single decision, made in the cold November light outside a corner grocery, would set in motion a story that the city of Cleveland, and eventually the whole country, would not forget. Before we get into it, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit the subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. East Cleveland in late November had a way of looking gray even when the sun was out. The kind of gray that settled into the bricks of the old apartment buildings, into the chain-link fences leaning at slow, defeated angles, into the faces of the people waiting at the bus stops with their hands jammed deep into thin coats. The wind came off Lake Erie and cut through everything. It rattled the loose metal of street signs. It pushed empty plastic bags down the gutters in long, lazy somersaults. It found every gap in every jacket and reminded you that winter was not coming. Winter had already arrived and decided to stay. On a corner 2 blocks from the lake, where a small family-run grocery called Marshall Foods had been operating for 43 years, the wind was especially unkind. The door of the store opened and closed all day with the soft electronic chime of a bell that needed replacing, and each time it opened, a gust of cold air slipped in along with whoever was coming through. Elijah Monroe stood across the street from that door, hands buried in the sleeves of a jacket that had once belonged to a cousin, and before that to someone neither of them had ever met. His sneakers were 2 sizes too big, stuffed at the toes with folded newspaper so they would not slide off his feet when he ran. He was watching the door because he was waiting for the right moment, though even he was not sure exactly what the right moment looked like. He was not planning to steal. His mother, before she got sick, before everything fell apart, had taught him that stealing was a door you opened once and could never fully close again. He was only hoping that someone, anyone, might drop a coin, or set a bag down for a second too long, or leave behind a piece of bread on the bench outside. Hope, Elijah had learned, was a thing you held very lightly, like a moth, because if you squeezed too hard it would crumble in your hand. He had been on his own for almost 3 weeks. His grandmother, who had taken him in after his mother passed, had been moved to a care facility after a fall, and the social worker had said there would be a placement, a foster home, a plan, a temporary something, but the days had stretched and no one had come. So Elijah had stopped sleeping at the apartment. He was afraid that if he stayed too long in one place, someone in a suit would arrive and take him somewhere he did not know, and he had heard stories from older kids about places like that, stories that made the cold sidewalk feel like the safer choice. He carried his life in a backpack with one broken strap. Inside it was a notebook, a stub of a pencil, a small photograph of his mother holding him as a baby, and a single peppermint candy he was saving for a moment he could not yet imagine. He was waiting, in his own quiet way, to be seen. The man who finally stepped out of Marshall Foods that afternoon did not look like a man who needed help. He looked like a man who had lived a long time and learned how to carry his own things. He was tall, even slightly stooped as he was, with a head of silver hair cut short and neat, and a long charcoal gray wool coat that was clearly expensive but old, the kind of coat that had been bought once, decades ago, by someone who never saw the point of buying another. He wore plain brown leather gloves and a scarf the color of dry oak leaves. In his right hand was a cane, dark wood, with a worn brass handle, and in the crook of his left arm were 2 paper grocery bags, the kind the store still used because the owner refused to switch to plastic. The bags were full, too full. The bottom of the one on the outside was already darkening with a damp spot where something inside had begun to leak, and the paper near the handle was starting to soften and pull. His name was Harold Whitaker, and he was 78 years old. He had walked into Marshall Foods the way he had walked into 1,000 other small stores in 1,000 other neighborhoods over the past 50 years, quietly, without ceremony, paying in cash for the few things he needed. The young woman at the register had not known him. She had only smiled politely and counted his change and told him to have a good evening. That was exactly how Harold preferred it. He had not driven himself to East Cleveland that afternoon, but his car and his driver were waiting 6 blocks away in a parking lot near the lake, because Harold had a habit, one his late wife used to tease him about, of asking to be dropped off some distance from wherever he was actually going. He liked to walk. He liked to see. He liked to be reminded that the world was made of streets and storefronts and small daily acts, not of boardrooms and conference calls and quarterly reports. Elijah saw the bag begin to tear before Harold did. He saw the soft paper give way along the seam at the bottom, just a small split at first, the way ice cracks on a pond before it really breaks. He saw the old man shift his weight, plant the cane, and try to adjust his grip. And he saw in that small, careful motion something that had nothing to do with money or coats or canes. He saw a person who was tired. He saw a person who was going to drop the bag in about 3 more steps, and then stand there on the sidewalk feeling foolish in front of people who would not stop to help. Elijah did not think about it. He crossed the street. "Sir," he said, stepping up beside Harold with both hands already half raised, careful, the way you approach a cat you do not want to startle. "Sir, your bag, it is about to tear. Let me carry that for you." Harold turned his head. His eyes were a clear, watery blue, the color of a sky that had been washed too many times, and they took a second to find the small face looking up at him from somewhere near his elbow. He blinked. He looked down at the bag. The split at the bottom had widened, and a single orange was now pressed against the paper, ready to roll out into the street. Harold made a small sound that was almost a laugh, the kind of sound an old man makes when he is caught between embarrassment and gratitude and has not quite decided which one to lean into. "Well," Harold said, his voice low and dry like a page turning, "I suppose you are right about that." Elijah very gently reached up and slid both of his thin arms under the bottom of the failing bag. The paper rustled. The orange shifted but did not fall. He lifted, and the weight of the groceries pressed into his chest, and for a moment he was reminded of how little he had eaten, how the hunger sat in his ribs like a quiet animal, but he did not let his face change. He had practiced not letting his face change. He took the whole bag carefully into his own arms, leaving Harold with only the second one, the lighter one, the one that was not about to come apart. "Thank you, young man," Harold said. He looked for the first time properly at the boy in front of him, the thin jacket, the big sneakers, the careful eyes. He did not say anything about what he saw. "Where are you headed, sir?" Elijah asked, adjusting the bag in his arms so the bottom would not give out the rest of the way. He kept his voice polite, the way his mother had taught him, with the sir at the end like a small, careful bow. "I can walk with you, just so it does not fall." Harold considered the boy for a long moment. There was a stillness to Harold Whitaker that some people over the years had mistaken for coldness, but it was not coldness. It was the stillness of a man who had learned, painfully and slowly, to look at things twice before deciding what they were. He had seen too many people in his life rush to a conclusion and miss the truth standing right in front of them. So he stood there on the sidewalk outside Marshall Foods, his cane planted firm on the cracked concrete, and he looked. He looked at the boy's face. He looked at the boy's hands, which were red at the knuckles from the cold. He looked at the careful, almost formal way the boy was holding the broken bag, as if he had been entrusted with something fragile and important and was determined not to fail. "I am parked," Harold said slowly, "about 6 blocks from here, near the lake. It is a long walk for a small person carrying a heavy bag." "I do not mind, sir," Elijah said. He did not, in fact, mind. His legs were tired. His stomach was hollow. But there was something steadying about being asked to do a thing, about having a purpose to put his small body toward. The sidewalk had been a place of waiting all afternoon. Now suddenly it was a place of going somewhere. "All right then," Harold said. He shifted the second bag higher into the crook of his arm and tapped his cane once on the ground, the way a man taps the start of a journey. "Let us walk." They walked. The wind off the lake pushed against them in long, cold gusts that made Elijah duck his chin into the collar of his jacket and made Harold's coat flap softly around his knees. They did not speak much at first. Harold had never been a man who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and Elijah was concentrating on the bag, on keeping his arms steady, on not letting the orange roll out the bottom. They passed a closed barber shop with a hand-painted sign in the window. They passed a laundromat where the light spilled warm and yellow onto the sidewalk, and the air through the vents smelled of soap and dryer sheets. They passed a man sitting on a milk crate outside a corner liquor store who nodded once at Harold and once at Elijah as if he had seen the two of them walking together every day of his life. After the third block, Harold spoke. "What is your name, young man?" Elijah, sir. Elijah Monroe. Elijah. Harold rolled the name slowly, the way a man tastes a wine he has not had in a long time. That is a strong name, a prophet's name. My mother picked it, Elijah said. His voice did not change much, but Harold, who had spent a lifetime listening to the things people did not quite say, heard the small dip in it, the careful way the boy used the past tense without leaning on it. She chose well, Harold said. He let the silence sit for a few more steps, and then he asked gently, "And what does your mother do, Elijah?" Elijah's arms tightened a little around the bag. He looked straight ahead at the sidewalk in front of him, at the cracks the cold had widened over the years, and he said, "She passed, sir, almost a year ago now." Harold did not say "I am sorry" the way most people did, in the quick, hollow way that closed a door instead of opening one. He simply nodded slowly and said, "Then she is still picking your name every time you say it." And Elijah, who had not cried in front of anyone in a very long time because crying in front of people was a luxury he could not afford, felt something hot move behind his eyes and pressed his lips together hard and did not let it out. They kept walking. The cane tapped a slow, even rhythm on the concrete. The wind pushed and pulled at them. Somewhere far away, a freight train let out a long, low note that seemed to belong to the gray sky itself. And Elijah, carrying a stranger's groceries through a neighborhood that had taught him to expect nothing, felt for the first time in weeks that he was not entirely alone in the world. Harold did not ask about the father. He did not ask where Elijah lived, or who was waiting for him at home, or why a 10-year-old boy was standing outside a grocery store at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in November, when other children his age were sitting in warm classrooms or eating snacks at kitchen tables. He had learned, over a long life of meeting people in difficult circumstances, that questions could feel like accusations when they came too fast, and that the most important things a person needed to tell you would arrive in their own time if you let them. So he walked and he listened to the soft scrape of the boy's oversized sneakers on the sidewalk, and he made a small, quiet calculation in his head, the way he had made calculations in boardrooms and on factory floors and in hospital waiting rooms for more than 50 years. The calculation was this: the boy was hungry. The boy was alone. The boy was carrying a stranger's groceries for the simple reason that the bag was about to break, and he had nothing to gain from it that he could name. "Elijah," Harold said after another block, "do you live near here?" "Sort of, sir," Elijah said. He chose the words carefully. Sort of was a phrase he had learned to use for many things in the past year. Sort of meant not really, but also do not ask me to explain. "A few streets over. And is anyone expecting you for supper?" The question was so gentle that Elijah almost did not feel the edge of it. He looked up at Harold, at the long gray coat, at the silver hair, at the patient blue eyes, and he understood, in the way a small animal understands the shape of safety even before it has the words for it, that the old man already knew the answer. He did not know how, he just knew. "No, sir," Elijah said. "Not really." Harold nodded once. He did not stop walking. He did not change the rhythm of his cane. He simply absorbed the answer the way the ground absorbs rain, and he kept moving. They turned the corner onto a wider street where the buildings began to thin out, and the cold smell of the lake grew stronger, that particular smell of November water and wet stone that anyone who has lived near Lake Erie carries in them forever. 2 blocks ahead, in a small gravel parking lot beside a closed bait shop, Elijah could see a long, dark car waiting, the kind of car he had only ever seen in movies or parked outside the courthouse downtown. A man in a dark suit and a wool driver's cap was standing beside it, hands clasped in front of him, watching the street the way a person watches a door he is responsible for. Elijah's steps slowed without him meaning them to. He had not expected the car. He had not expected the driver. He had assumed somewhere in the back of his mind that the old man would walk all the way home, that home was a small apartment somewhere with a kettle on the stove and a chair by the window. The dark car did not fit into that picture. The dark car belonged to a different story altogether. Harold felt the boy hesitate beside him. "That is just Marcus," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "He drives me. He has been driving me for 22 years. He is a good man. He will not bother you." "Yes, sir," Elijah said, but his arms had tightened around the bag again, and his eyes had grown very watchful. He had survived 3 weeks on the street by paying attention to which situations were safe and which were not, and a strange car with a strange man beside it was not, in the part of the city where he had grown up, usually a thing that ended well for a small boy. Marcus, the driver, saw them coming from half a block away. He straightened, but he did not move toward them. He had been told many times by Mr. Whitaker not to rush, not to crowd, not to make a scene. Marcus had a kind, square face and a small graying mustache, and when he saw that his employer was walking with a child carrying a torn grocery bag. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but his eyes softened in the corners. He had worked for Harold Whitaker long enough to know that the old man rarely arrived back at the car alone and almost never arrived back without a small story attached. "Marcus," Harold said as they reached the gravel lot, "this is Elijah Monroe. He has been kind enough to keep my groceries from rolling into the street." Marcus tipped his cap. "Mr. Monroe," he said with complete seriousness, "thank you for your help." Elijah did not know what to do with being called Mr. Monroe. No one had ever called him that. Teachers had called him Elijah, his mother had called him Eli and sometimes my heart, and the older kids on the block had called him things that he tried not to repeat even in his own head. Mr. Monroe was a name that belonged to a grown man in a suit, a name that suggested he was a person worth addressing properly, and it landed in his chest with a strange, warm weight. He nodded carefully to Marcus and said, "Yes, sir," because it was the only response he could think of that felt right. Marcus stepped forward and reached for the torn bag, and Elijah, for a half-second, did not want to give it up. The bag had been his job, his reason for walking, the small, important thing he had been entrusted with, and handing it over felt like the end of something. But Marcus's hands were patient and his eyes were kind, and Elijah let the bag slide gently into the driver's arms. The orange, which had been threatening to escape for 6 blocks, was finally safe. "Thank you, Elijah," Harold said. He reached into the inside pocket of his long gray coat, and Elijah saw the movement and felt his stomach tighten. He knew what came next. He had imagined it the entire walk, had almost allowed himself to hope for it, and now that the moment had arrived he found, to his own surprise, that he did not want it. He did not want this old man, who had spoken to him kindly and called his mother's name a prophet's name, to reach into a pocket and hand him a folded bill and turn the whole afternoon into a transaction. He took a small step back. "I did not do it for money, sir," he said. His voice was quiet but very clear. "I did it because the bag was about to break." Harold's hand paused inside his coat. He looked at the boy for a long moment, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was close to one, the way the first light of morning is not quite sunrise, but tells you the sunrise is coming. He withdrew his hand from the coat. It was empty. "I know you did not," Harold said. "I was reaching for something else." He produced instead a small white business card, the kind printed on heavy paper that bends but does not fold easily. He held it out between 2 gloved fingers. "This has my name on it, and a telephone number. The number rings to a woman named Dorothy who has worked for me for 30 years. If you ever find yourself in a difficult situation, Elijah, and you need a person to call, you may call that number. You do not have to explain anything. You only have to say, 'This is Elijah, and I met Mr. Whitaker outside Marshall Foods.' Dorothy will know what to do." Elijah took the card. His fingers were cold and clumsy, and the paper felt impossibly smooth between them. He looked down at it. Printed in plain black letters, no logo, no fancy lettering, was a name. Harold J. Whitaker, below it a phone number, nothing else. No title, no company, no address. He turned the card over. The back was blank. He did not know, holding that card in his red-knuckled hand on a gravel lot in East Cleveland on a cold Tuesday afternoon, that the name Harold J. Whitaker had appeared on the front of business magazines and in the financial pages of every major American newspaper for the better part of 40 years. He did not know that the company Harold had founded in a rented garage in 1971, a small manufacturing concern that made specialized parts for industrial machinery, had grown over the decades into one of the largest privately held companies in the Midwest, with factories in 9 states and offices in 3 countries. He did not know that Harold Whitaker had been on the cover of Forbes twice and had quietly declined a 3rd invitation because he did not like having his picture taken. He did not know that the man standing in front of him in the long gray coat could have bought the entire block of Marshall Foods and every building on it with what he kept in a single checking account. He only knew that the old man had given him a card with a name and a number on it and had told him he could call. "Thank you, sir," Elijah said. He slipped the card very carefully into the inside pocket of his too-big jacket, the pocket closest to his heart, the same pocket where he kept the photograph of his mother. Harold and Marcus exchanged a look over the boy's head that lasted no more than a second. It was a look that had passed between them many times before, in many different parking lots, in many different cities, over 22 years of driving. Marcus gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he has already understood the question before it is asked. He turned and opened the rear door of the long, dark car, and the warm air from inside spilled out onto the gravel, carrying with it the soft smell of leather and clean wool. "Elijah," Harold said, "before we say goodbye, I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to feel free to say no. I'm going to have supper in about an hour at a small restaurant not far from here. The owner is a friend of mine. The food is simple and very good. I would be glad of the company if you would join me." He paused. He did not lean down. He did not soften his voice into the patronizing tone that adults sometimes used with children when they were trying to be kind. He spoke to Elijah the way he would have spoken to any guest. "You are not obligated. Marcus can take you wherever you need to go, with no supper at all if that is what you prefer. I only wanted to ask." Elijah stood very still in the gravel lot. The wind off the lake was pushing at the back of his neck, and his stomach, which had been quiet for hours by sheer force of practice, gave a small, treacherous turn at the word supper. He thought about the peppermint candy in his backpack, the one he had been saving for a moment he could not imagine. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to be careful with strangers, and who had also taught him that some strangers were not strangers at all, but neighbors he had not yet met. He looked up at Harold's face. He looked at the patient blue eyes, the silver hair, the brown leather gloves folded calmly around the brass handle of the cane. He looked at Marcus, who had stepped back a respectful distance and was pretending to inspect something on the door of the car. "Yes, sir," Elijah said. His voice was small but steady. "I would like that. Thank you, sir." Harold nodded once, as if a small, important agreement had been settled, and gestured toward the open door of the car. Elijah hesitated at the threshold the way a person hesitates at the edge of deep water, and then he climbed in. The seat was wider than his grandmother's couch. The leather was warm. There was a soft hum somewhere under the floor that he realized, after a moment, was a heater running quietly to keep the inside of the car comfortable while it waited. He had never been inside a car like this. He sat very still, his backpack on his lap, and tried not to touch anything he did not need to touch. Harold settled in beside him with the slow, careful movements of a man whose joints had stopped forgiving him a decade ago. Marcus closed the door, walked around to the front, and slid into the driver's seat. The car pulled out of the gravel lot and turned onto the wide street that ran along the lake, and Elijah watched through the window as East Cleveland slid past him in a way it never had before. From a car, the neighborhood looked smaller. The broken sidewalks did not bite at his oversized sneakers. The wind could not find him. "Marcus," Harold said, "the place on Larchmere, please. Tell Anna we will be two for supper and that one of us is a young man with a very honest face." "Yes, sir," Marcus said. He glanced once into the rearview mirror, met Elijah's eyes, and gave him a small, reassuring smile that did not require any words. The drive took about 15 minutes. They left the gray streets near the lake and moved south through neighborhoods that Elijah had only ever seen from city buses. He watched the houses grow larger, the trees thicker, the sidewalks cleaner. He did not say anything. Harold did not push him to say anything. The old man sat with his cane resting between his knees and his gloved hands folded over the brass handle, and he looked out his own window with the quiet expression of a man who had seen these same streets 1,000 times and still found something in them worth looking at. Larchmere Boulevard was a long, tree-lined street of small shops and old brick buildings, and the restaurant Harold had spoken of was tucked between an antique bookstore and a tailor's. Its name, painted in modest gold letters on the front window, was Anna's. The restaurant was small and warm and smelled of bread. That was the first thing Elijah noticed when Marcus held the door open for him, and the bell above the door gave its soft, friendly chime. The smell of bread, the kind that has been baking slowly for hours, the kind that wraps itself around you the moment you step inside a place, and makes your shoulders come down from your ears without your permission. There were maybe 12 tables in the whole room, each one covered with a plain white cloth, each one set with simple white plates and heavy silverware that looked like it had been polished by hand. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the color of butter left out on a counter, and there were old framed photographs hung in mismatched frames showing a younger woman in a kitchen, a man in an apron holding up a fish, two children on a beach somewhere far from Ohio. A woman in her 60s came out from a swinging door at the back, wiping her hands on a clean white towel. She was short and round and had her gray hair pulled back into a low bun, and when she saw Harold standing inside the door, she made a small sound of pleasure that came from somewhere deep in her chest and crossed the room with her arms already opening. "Harold," she said, taking both of his hands in hers. "It has been 3 weeks, 3 weeks, Harold. I know Anna, forgive me. The doctors have been keeping me on a short rope lately." "The doctors should mind their own business," Anna said firmly, but she was smiling, and then she turned and looked down at Elijah, who was standing half a step behind Harold with his backpack clutched in front of him like a small shield. Anna's face did not change in any sudden way. She did not gasp or coo or do any of the things adults sometimes did when they noticed a child who looked the way Elijah looked. She simply lowered herself slowly until her face was level with his, and she said, with the same warm directness she had used with Harold, "And you must be the young man with the honest face. I am Anna. This is my restaurant. You are very welcome here." "Thank you, ma'am," Elijah said. "I am Elijah." "Elijah." She repeated it the way Harold had, slowly, as if the name deserved its proper weight. "A beautiful name. Are you hungry, Elijah?" He hesitated. He had been taught not to admit to hunger in front of people who did not know him, because hunger admitted out loud was a thing that made adults uncomfortable, and uncomfortable adults made bad decisions. But Anna's face was patient, and Harold was standing quietly behind him, and the smell of the bread was so strong and so good that he could feel it in his throat. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I think I am." "Good," Anna said and stood. "Then we have already done the most important part." She led them to a table near the front window, where the late afternoon light came in soft and gold through the glass, and she pulled out a chair for Elijah with the same formal courtesy she would have shown a senator. He sat. The chair was solid and warm. Anna disappeared back through the swinging door, and a moment later a young woman in a long apron brought a basket of bread to the table, still warm from the oven, with a small dish of butter and another of olive oil. Harold settled himself across from Elijah with a quiet sigh. He set his cane against the side of the table where it would not fall. He took off his gloves and folded them neatly. Then he reached for the bread basket and tore a piece for himself slowly and pushed the basket gently toward the middle of the table where Elijah could reach it. "Eat as much as you like," Harold said. "Anna will keep bringing it as long as we keep eating it. That is how she is." Elijah reached for a piece of bread. His hand was shaking just slightly in the way hands shake when a body has been waiting too long for something and finally allows itself to believe the thing is real. He tore the bread carefully, the way he would have torn a page he did not want to damage. He dipped a small corner of it in the olive oil. He put it in his mouth. The bread tasted like a memory he did not know he had. He chewed slowly. He did not cry. He had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that he was not going to cry in front of Harold. But his eyes stung, and he kept them down on the white tablecloth, and he ate. Harold did not watch him eat. That was the kindness Elijah noticed first, and the one he would remember for the rest of his life. Harold did not lean forward in his chair, did not study the boy's face, did not say any of the soft, pitying things adults sometimes said when they saw a hungry child eating in front of them. Harold simply tore his own piece of bread, dipped it in his own oil, and turned his face slightly toward the window so that Elijah could eat in peace. He spoke now and then about small, easy things. The weather. The way the trees on Larchmere had lost their leaves later than usual this year. A baseball game from the previous summer that Marcus had taken him to. He spoke the way a person speaks to fill a room with a gentle, undemanding sound, the way you leave a radio on for someone who is recovering from something difficult. Anna brought soup. She brought a plate of roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans cooked in butter. She brought a small glass of milk for Elijah and a cup of black coffee for Harold, and refilled the bread basket twice without being asked. She did not ask Elijah any questions. She did not ask Harold any questions either. She simply moved through the small, warm room like a person who had decided long ago that the people at her tables were her people, and that her job was to feed them and let them be. Halfway through the chicken, Elijah set his fork down. He had eaten more in the last 20 minutes than he had eaten in the last 3 days combined, and his stomach, which had grown used to being empty, was protesting the sudden bounty in small, uncertain ways. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the plate. He looked at Harold. "Sir," he said, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," Harold said. Elijah took a small breath. "Why are you doing this?" Harold did not answer right away. He set his own fork down. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the cup back into its saucer with the careful precision of a man who had spent a long life around fragile things. He looked at Elijah across the white tablecloth, and the late afternoon light through the window caught the silver of his hair and made it look, for a moment, almost gold. "That is a good question," Harold said. "It deserves an honest answer." He paused. "When I was about your age, Elijah, I lived in a town in western Pennsylvania that does not exist anymore. The mill closed, and then the town closed, the way towns do when the work goes away. My father had been gone for a long time by then, and my mother was a seamstress who took in mending for the families who still had a little money. We did not have much. There were days, more than I like to remember, when I went to school hungry, and there were days when I came home from school hungrier still, because my mother had given me the only piece of bread in the house for my lunch and had eaten nothing herself." He stopped. He took another sip of coffee. Elijah did not move. One afternoon, Harold went on, I was walking home from school in the cold and I passed a small grocery on the corner of our street and I saw an old woman drop a sack of apples on the sidewalk outside. The sack had split. The apples rolled everywhere. She was bent over trying to pick them up and she could not quite manage it because her back was not what it used to be. I was 9 years old. I was hungry enough that the smell of those apples on the cold sidewalk almost made me dizzy. And I had a choice, the way you had a choice this afternoon outside Marshall Foods. I could have picked up one of those apples and put it in my pocket and walked away, and she would not have known, and no one in the world would have blamed me if they had known. He looked at Elijah very steadily. I did not do that, Harold said. I picked up every one of those apples and I put them back in her arms and I walked her to her door. And when we got to her door, she invited me in and she gave me a bowl of stew that I can still taste if I close my eyes. He paused. Her name was Mrs. Kowalski. She fed me supper twice a week for the next 4 years. She is the reason I am sitting here tonight. Elijah was very still. You did for me today, Harold said quietly, what I did for her a long time ago, so I am doing for you what she did for me. Elijah looked down at the white tablecloth for a long time. The story had landed in him in a place that did not yet have words for what it was feeling. He thought about the apples rolling on a cold Pennsylvania sidewalk 70 years ago. He thought about a small boy with empty pockets choosing to give back what no one would have known he had taken. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski, whoever she had been, who had opened her door to a hungry child and changed the shape of a life she could not possibly have foreseen. He thought about his own mother who had said to him once, sitting on the edge of his bed when he was 7 and feverish and could not sleep, the only way the world gets better, baby, is when people decide to be the better part of it. He had not understood her then. He thought he might be beginning to understand her now. Sir, he said, and his voice was very small, I do not know how to say thank you for this. You do not have to, Harold said. You already did, outside the store. They finished their meal slowly. Anna brought a small dish of vanilla ice cream for Elijah without asking, and Harold did not protest. The light through the window deepened from gold into the soft blue that comes just before evening, and the other tables in the restaurant began to fill with quiet people in coats, neighbors and regulars who nodded to Anna and to Harold as they passed. Elijah ate the ice cream one careful spoonful at a time, making it last, the way he had learned to make small good things last. When the meal was over, Harold settled the bill with Anna in a way that Elijah did not see, because Harold had a particular skill for handling money in a manner that did not make a child feel like a charity case. Anna walked them to the door. She bent down to Elijah's height again, and she said, You come back any time, Elijah, with Harold or without. You tell whoever is at the door that Anna is expecting you, and there will always be a plate. Yes, ma'am, Elijah said. Thank you, ma'am. Outside, the air had grown colder, but it did not bite the way it had earlier in the afternoon. Marcus was waiting beside the car with the same calm patience he had shown in the gravel lot, and he opened the rear door without a word. Harold paused on the sidewalk before getting in. He turned to Elijah. I am going to ask you one more thing tonight, Elijah, and again you are free to say no. He looked at the boy carefully. Marcus and I are going to drive back across the city now. The house I live in has more rooms than any one old man needs. There is a small guest room on the first floor with a bed that has clean sheets on it, and a bathroom of its own, and a door that locks from the inside. There is a woman named Dorothy, the one whose number is on the card I gave you, who lives in a cottage on the property and looks after the house. She is a grandmother 8 times over, and she is kinder than I am, which is saying something. I would like to offer you that room, for tonight. For as many nights as you need while we figure out together what comes next. You would not be a guest who has to earn his keep. You would be a young man under my roof, and you would be safe there. He paused. You may say no, Elijah. Marcus will take you anywhere you ask him to take you. I will not be hurt, and I will not be offended. But I am 78 years old, and I have learned that some offers, when they come, should be made plainly. So I am making it plainly. Elijah stood on the sidewalk outside Anna's restaurant in his too big jacket and his too big sneakers, and he looked up at the old man in the long gray coat, and he thought about the card in his pocket, and the photograph of his mother in the same pocket, and the bed with clean sheets that he had not slept in for 3 weeks, and the door that locked from the inside. He thought about his grandmother in the care facility, who he had not been allowed to see, and the social worker who had not come. He thought about the cold of the sidewalk and the long, hungry nights, and the small, careful animal of hope he had been trying not to crush in his hand all afternoon. Yes, sir, he said. Thank you, sir. I would like that. The drive back across the city took longer than the drive to the restaurant, because Harold's house was not in the city at all. It was east of it, past the suburbs Elijah had only ever seen on highway signs, on a quiet road lined with old trees that had been standing there since long before any of them had been born. Elijah watched the streetlights give way to porch lights, and the porch lights give way to long stretches of dark countryside where the only light was the moon on the bare November fields. He did not say anything for most of the drive. Harold did not push him to. Marcus drove with the same steady patience he had shown all evening, and once, when Elijah's eyes began to grow heavy in the warm leather seat, Marcus adjusted the heater a small degree higher without being asked. The house, when they reached it, was not the kind of house Elijah had imagined a rich man would live in. It was a long, low farmhouse made of pale stone, with a slate roof and warm yellow light coming from the windows on the lower floor. There was a wreath on the door made of dried wheat and a single red ribbon. Dorothy was already waiting in the front hall when they came inside, and she was exactly as Harold had described her, a small woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had been kind for so long that the kindness had settled into the lines of it permanently. She did not make a fuss over Elijah. She simply said, "Welcome, young man. The guest room is made up. Are you tired?" And Elijah, who had not realized until that moment how tired he was, nodded. That was the beginning. The story did not end that night because real stories rarely do. It went on through the winter and into the spring. Harold's lawyers, quietly and carefully, helped Elijah's grandmother get the medical care she needed and helped Elijah become her legal ward, with Harold and Dorothy named as guardians in the event she could not return. Elijah went back to school, a different school, where he was allowed to be quiet and was not asked questions he could not answer. He kept the small white business card in the inside pocket of a new jacket that fit him properly, and he kept the photograph of his mother in the same pocket, and he kept the peppermint candy too, because he had decided that the moment he had been saving it for was the moment he no longer needed to save it. The story of how they met did not become a viral video. There were no security cameras on the corner of 8th and Marshall that afternoon, and no one in the city of Cleveland had any idea that one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest had bought groceries at a family-run store and let a hungry child carry his bag. The story stayed where it began between the two of them, the way the most important stories often do. Harold did not write about it. Elijah did not tell anyone at his new school. Only Marcus and Anna and Dorothy knew, and they were the kind of people who knew how to keep a thing that was not theirs to tell. Years passed. Harold lived longer than his doctors had told him he would, the way stubborn men sometimes do when they have found a reason to stay. He saw Elijah graduate from high school. He saw him accepted into a university on a scholarship that Harold had arranged without ever letting Elijah know it had been arranged. He did not see him graduate from college, because he died quietly in his sleep in the small stone farmhouse the winter before, with Dorothy holding his hand and Elijah sitting in the chair beside the bed reading aloud from a book Harold had given him years earlier. In Harold's will, there was a letter for Elijah. It was short. It said, "I want you to remember 3 things. The first is that your mother chose your name. The second is that you carried my groceries when no one else would. The third is that the world gets better only when people decide to be the better part of it, and you, Elijah Monroe, were the better part of mine." Elijah is 43 years old now. He runs a foundation in Cleveland that finds children who are sleeping where they should not be sleeping and offers them a door that locks from the inside and a bed with clean sheets. He named the foundation after a woman in Pennsylvania he never met. He calls it Kowalski House. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you and subscribe for more stories of quiet kindness and second chances. Thank you for being here.